Good morning, history class. I wish I could see you. I hate that you can only see me because I miss you. But I got some things I want to share with you today, so I hope you'll listen and I hope you pay attention. We've been studying the pre-Civil War. And I got two people in here with me, by the way, helping me make this movie. So I'm going to be talking to them some, and I'm going to be talking to you the whole time. But we've been talking about the 1850s. The 1850s was one of the roughest periods in American history. It was full of drama, and our government didn't seem to know how to deal with the problems. We had some presidents in that period. Let me see if I can think of them. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. Nobody knows anything about those three because basically they did nothing except make mistakes. And these mistakes are going to lead to the worst episode in United States history, and that will be the Civil War. So our discussion today is going to be to add some things to something that you've already read, and that is, what are the events that triggered the Civil War? And so let's get started. But before I get started, I can't let this pass. I got to talk about COVID-19 for just a minute. I told you on the webpage, I'm sick of COVID-19. Wears me out. I hope you're sick of it too. But there's some things about COVID-19 other than getting sick that bother me. And I'm going to use this as a lead into our discussion of the 1850s. I think that some of our governments in places, not in Jackson and not even in Tennessee, but in some of our states, have really made some major mistakes in handling COVID-19. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In some of the states, churches have been closed. In fact, I guess in all of the states except maybe for South Dakota, churches have been closed. But liquor stores remain open, which sounds a little interesting to me. Another group, prisoners, convicts who have committed crimes, have been turned loose because, according to government officials, they didn't want COVID-19 to get into the prison population. But at the same time, they closed gun stores. I think some of the decisions that have been made stand to be questioned. In Maine, the governor yesterday announced that she couldn't see an end to the lockdown in that state. They've only got 33 cases of COVID-19 out of more than 1 million people. But the governor says the state is locked down until further notice. In Michigan, 5 businesses filed suit yesterday trying to force the governor of that state to reopen. They say they're going bankrupt and that she doesn't have the constitutional authority to do what she's doing. So yeah, government makes mistakes. We can't depend on government to solve all of our problems. That's today, but let's go back to 1850. And let me tell you about a fellow by the name of Dred Scott. Now, you've already read about him. I don't know if you remember much. His story is that he was a slave. His owner took him to Minnesota, which being way up north was free territory. And at some point along the line, this guy's owner, Dred Scott's owner, passed. Now, when the owner passed, and since he had been in free territory, Minnesota, he thought that he should be given his freedom. And so some of his white friends petitioned one of the local courts, and the case was tried. The courts didn't make a firm decision, and you've already studied through the Constitution that we've got layers of courts. The highest layer is the Supreme Court that meets in Washington. So in the mid-1850s, Dred Scott's case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court does in this case is going to be really important for what happens in the Civil War. This is what happened after the arguments were made. This is what the Supreme Court ruled. See if you agree with it or not. First of all, they told Dred Scott that he didn't have any standing in that court. That means that they weren't going to hear his case or rule in his behalf, because in essence what they told him was that he wasn't a citizen. There might be a way to look at that where they really told him that they didn't think he was human. And once they ruled that way, then the second thing the Supreme Court said was it's not constitutional for the federal government to take private property from a citizen. Great day. How do you have a human being that's basically classified as a non-human being? Rather, he's classified as property. Well, that ruling was wrong. It was made by the highest level of government, and it was a mistake that would further inflame the issue of slavery throughout the whole United States. A terrible ruling. That's not the only mistake that was made. You remember the Compromise of 1850? Yeah, that compromise that Henry Clay suggested. It had to have a compromise because California wanted to be admitted into the Union, but it was going to come in as a free state. Slave states weren't going to approve that. So Clay's suggestion was to pass a Fugitive Slave Act. Now, they didn't have an act like that before the Compromise of 1850, but what it said was that slaves who had escaped from the South and who were finding shelter in the North, in those safe houses like you read about with Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, it would become a violation of the law for Northerners to shelter runaway slaves. So, of course, the South liked that. North didn't like it. But in order to get California admitted to the Union, the Compromise of 1850 was passed by Congress. It was a terrible move for slaves, at least on the short term, but in the long term it worked out good. But those people that ran the safe houses, in addition to having to have a heart of assistance for slaves and compassion for slaves, they also had to have courage because now their lives were on the line. One of the things that happened after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act was it prompted a lady by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe to write a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of the most influential things that happened in United States history to convince American people that slavery was wrong. Harriet Beecher Stowe's father was a pastor. In fact, he was very well known in his period, especially in the New England area. So she got her theological foundation and her belief in God from her dad, and she believed fully in her heart that slavery was wrong. So she came up with the idea of writing a book. She was a good writer. She had taught English and some other subjects at Harvard University, so she was very educated and knowledgeable about how to do this. So she wrote this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and what Uncle Tom's Cabin was a description of a group of slaves who were mistreated by a really mean master. The guy was named Simon Legree. But the important part of this was that a lot of people read the book. In fact, statistics of the day say that she sold over 300,000 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was by far the largest selling novel in American history. And it was so popular that the book made it over to Europe. And in Europe, they sold almost 1 million copies. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe got famous. She personally benefited from all of this, but the big issue was that it promoted the idea of the abolition of slavery. When people read the book, they became abolitionists if they had a heart beating in their chest, because she had done a masterful job of describing how badly Simon Legree treated Uncle Tom. So as more and more people read this book, the number of abolitionists in the North grew exponentially. And it's said that at the beginning of the Civil War, that President Abraham Lincoln, who had never met Harriet Beecher Stowe, met her, and the first thing out of his mouth was, he says, "So you're the little lady that started the Civil War," which he meant as a compliment, indicating that what she had done had been very influential. So the Fugitive Slave Act, which was bad for slaves on the short term, worked out to be something good because it prompted Harriet Beecher Stowe to write this article, or write this novel, I should say. Now, I want to talk to you about a fellow by the name of John Brown. Have you ever heard of John Brown? Maybe not. We used to say when I was a kid, when we didn't like something, we'd say, "I'll be John Brown." I don't know if that was the same John Brown or not, but I always think of that every time I hear the name John Brown. The John Brown that I want to talk to you about was a radical abolitionist who believed that it was okay to use force to free slaves. But I'm going to take you back to his childhood for just a minute. He had 7 brothers and sisters, and his dad preached some of the time, and part of the time he ran a tannery. Now, you know what a tannery took cowhides and cured them into leather. Dad was pretty good at that. Made a good bit of money, enough to take care of all 8 children and hire some people. One of the people that worked for John Brown's father was named Jesse Grant, who happened to be the father of a future president named U.S. Grant, who also served as the lead general in the Civil War. Interesting bit of history. Not important, just interesting. Anyway, John Brown's father was a strong abolitionist, and he made sure that the Brown household was a safe house for slaves who were trying to get their way to freedom. So John Brown had a great foundation in the belief in abolition because his father presented him with that good example. He also went to a private school when he was a kid, and the guy that ran the private school was also an abolitionist. So John Brown would hear about slavery, and he would hear about abolition, the abolition movement every day. And it pressed in his mind a personal need for doing away with slavery. Now, when he was 20, he got married, moved to Pennsylvania. You remember Pennsylvania? You remember the religious group that founded Pennsylvania? Did you read the article about which religious group it was that was really instrumental in helping to organize the Underground Railroad? Do you remember that? They were the Quakers. And he got acquainted with the Quakers and a lot of other people too, but the older he got, the more convinced he was that God was calling him to try to do something special to end slavery. And so he opened up a tannery like his father had before him, and he was successful enough that he was able to employ 15 people. He created some jobs. He knew how to survey. He raised his own cattle. So you're talking about a man, John Brown, who was very intelligent as well as very driven to do what he thought God had called him to do. Now, at some point, there was a depression. I don't know if you guys in 8th grade know what a depression is or not, but a depression cost him his farm and his tannery. He lost everything, went broke, he went bankrupt. And in the process, not because of the depression, for natural causes, some of his children, and he had 13 in all, several of his children died during this period. So that was a very hard time for him psychologically. Let me relate this one instant. while he was still a fairly young man, he was sort of a community leader. He'd helped to establish a post office and a school in his town, and so other people in town looked to him for leadership. One day there was a group of people from town that knocked on his door, and they said, Mr. Brown, we've got a proposal for you. See, we've got these Native American Indians who are coming on our land and they hunt at a certain time every year. We're sick and tired of it. Would you be willing to join with us? And we will remove these Indians from our land because they're a nuisance. John Brown says, no, but he says, I'll tell you what I will do. I will be tickled to get my rifle and I will join them and we'll run you out of town. So they left, obviously. John Brown demonstrated yet again that he thought all men were created equal. He really believed that. He believed that irrespective of skin color or religion or anything of that nature, God loved you and that you were entitled to your rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that included the Indians and that included slaves. So we're going to kind of skip down a little bit. He had some sons that survived. Not all of his children died. They survived and they grew up. And for whatever reason, I have no idea why, they moved to Kansas. Well, when they arrived in Kansas, it was at a really difficult time for the people that lived there. So let me take you to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We're going to come back to John Brown in just a minute. Kansas had begun to fill up. They had achieved their population of 60,000, which according to the Northwest Ordinance meant that they could petition the Congress for statehood. But the question was that a lot of people that had moved to Kansas were pro-slavery. So what are we going to do about that? Will Kansas come into the Union as a slave state or as a free state? It's very important to answer that question. Well, it was supposed to have come in as a free state because the Missouri Compromise 30 years earlier had said that slavery would be forever banned north of the boundary line. That's roughly where the southern border of Missouri and Arkansas is located. Well, Congress was talking about violating their own law. That's crazy. That law had been in the books for 30 years, and now they're talking about violating their own law. Well, the Northerners were absolutely incensed. So a great discussion ensued. What are we going to do about Kansas? Well, the idea came up that we're going to use popular sovereignty to figure this out. We will let the people who plan on living in Kansas vote for themselves as to whether or not they want to be slave or free. Well, that sounded like a good idea, maybe if you don't think about it very long. I mean, it sounds democratic and it sounds like something a Republican form of government should do. But in this case, it was a horrible mistake. When they decided to let the people vote, all kind of weird stuff began to happen because there was a great divide between the people of Kansas. About half wanted it to be free and the other half wanted it to be slave. And they were vocal in their opinions. Tempers began to flare. People got angry and the anger turned to violence. And just before they had the vote, there were a bunch of hooligans. Do you know what a hooligan is? You know what a thug is? A bunch of thugs from Missouri came across. Most of them from Missouri were pro-slavery. And so they all illegally voted in the election. Well, when they counted the votes for the popular sovereignty vote, there was more votes cast than there were adults who actually lived in the state of Kansas. So they overturned the election and had another one. The second election, they were a little more careful about who they allowed to vote. And when the vote was in, Kansas had voted to become a free state. But through all of that, through that bogus election and the aftermath of it, the violence really picked up to the point where that period of Kansas history and that geographical region from this period of history is called Bleeding Kansas. Well, John Brown's sons were right in the middle of it. John Brown found out what was going on in Kansas, and knowing that his sons lived there, he decided that he would move to Kansas and he would take care of business. Well, shortly after he got there, an incident occurred called the Sack of Lawrence. Lawrence is a town in Kansas. It's still there. In fact, it's where the University of Kansas is located now, the Kansas Jayhawks, if you watch NCAA sports. Lawrence had been established by a bunch of people from Massachusetts who were abolitionists. So Lawrence was very much against slavery. Well, the pro-slavery forces picked Lawrence to attack. In fact, in this case, it wasn't a hooligan, it was the sheriff of the county who got a posse together. The sheriff now raided Lawrence, burned the hotel, destroyed the newspaper office, threatened everybody, and in the process, one person was killed. Well, this is when John Brown heard about the Sack of Lawrence. He was incensed. So he got his two sons and about a half a dozen other people that he knew that were also abolitionists, and they decided that they would go and take their revenge. So they got swords. Take guns, took swords. Real early in the morning, while some folks were still in bed, they broke into some houses and pulled some abolitionists out and ran their swords through them and killed them. They killed 5 people. Now, these weren't the only murders that had happened. There had already been 8 prior murders in that area within the last year. That rose the total to 13, but killing people with swords, pulling people out of their houses and running them through with swords was more than most people could stand. And so they began to refer to that as the massacre on Pottawatomie Creek. And there was a lot of aftermath to that. In fact, one of John Brown's sons was killed in some of the fighting that occurred after the massacre. Well, we're going to make a long story short. I'm going to cut it off right there. Eventually, a second election was held. Kansas came into the Union as a free state. And John Brown, with one son remaining in Kansas, moved back east.